Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and I'll be your guide on this journey from consciousness to cluelessness and back around again. Today on the podcast, I talk to Chloe Miko, all the way from Belgium. Chloe is a citizen lobbyist for Green EU policy. She is the founder of an environmental education NGO. She hosts her own podcast called The Burning Case Podcast, talking about politics and democracy. It was so amazing to talk to Chloe and be reminded how much change is needed on a systematic level and how we can do that. Enjoy the episode. So again, thank you so much for making this work and figuring out the time zone change. That's my major challenge in life.
Yeah, I can imagine. No worries. I'm really happy and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question I like asking is just kind of about how you're doing. So the podcast is called Consciously Clueless, and there's that idea of being conscious and being with it and feeling like we've got it figured out. And then there's those moments of, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm so clueless, what's going on, and everything in between. So I'm just curious where you feel like you are today or in this moment or whatever it is.
I'd say I'm okay. I really struggle every year with fire seasons because I don't know, just the thought of something so ancient and so beautiful as forest and everything that lives in the forest, so the animals and all the plants just being completely destroyed because of our decisions is something that really impacts me. So it's been happening every year. Last year was mainly the Amazon, and this year, I mean, it's of course the Amazon, it's also the fires in California. It really hits a button for me and it makes me really anxious and really sad. So like, this is not the best period of the year, and also with everything that's going on with coronavirus, it's just right. It's a really uncertain future. So yeah, it really depends on the day. Today's been a good day because I met a colleague and we worked together, so that was nice. But yeah, depends.
Yeah, that's interesting to think of the time of year. Like, we often talk about the time of year being hard in northern Minnesota, being, winter and kind of that time, but thinking about the destruction as the different seasons is really interesting, the way you put that.
Yeah, no, it's a struggle every year, but gotta keep moving on and believing that a better future is possible. Otherwise we wouldn't be, doing what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't be here talking, right?
Exactly.
So I really, really appreciate following you on social media because your ability to make these like really big topics approachable and digestible and understandable is really, really important. And I think that, so thank you for that, because I've learned a lot. But tell me a little bit more about being a lobbyist for the Green EU policy and like, what does that mean for us here in the States?
So essentially the EU is currently developing a green strategy, which is one of the most ambitious in the world. It's called the EU Green Deal, so a bit similar to what you have in the US with the Green New Deal. And when you look at the numbers, it is the most ambitious in the world when it comes to tackling climate breakdown, when it comes to biodiversity, when it comes to foods. It's really interesting, and it's really good to see that they're finally taking this into account. It's not where we should be in terms of science and in terms of actually reaching the objectives that were set at the Paris Agreement, but it's good. And the thing is, the EU is so important for the entire world, just like the US is in terms of influence. But the thing is, the EU is one of the largest markets in the world. So that means that Europeans consume a lot of stuff that comes from around the world. So the EU has a huge influence because whatever it decides is going to have consequences for the rest of the world. So just to give you an example, if the EU decides to stop making trade agreements with, I don't know, South America, which is all the countries under the term Mercosur, So that gathers, I think, 11 countries from South America, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
If the EU decides to put criteria in those trade agreements, environmental, sustainability, social justice criteria, then this has a huge influence, because losing a market like the EU is just an economic disaster for a lot of countries.
Wow.
So the EU really has this leadership. The problem is, as I was saying, it's not ambitious enough, and the EU sometimes kind of does 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because the influence of lobbyists here in Brussels, and especially corporate lobbyists, is huge. We are actually second only to Washington in terms of the amount of corporate lobbyists. We have 25,000 people here in Brussels that identify as lobbyists.
Wow.
And the amount in 2016, the amount that was poured into lobbying was 1.6 billion euros. So that's a lot of money for 1 year. And so the thing is, there's this presence on one side, the corporate lobbyists. And on the other side, there's the thing that the EU is not really accessible for a lot of people in Europe. It's being blamed for a lot of things that are going wrong in Europe. You know, every time there's a problem with the price of agricultural commodities, all the farmers are saying, well, it's the fault of the EU. Every time there's a ban on, I don't know, a certain product, oh, it's the fault of the EU. Because it wasn't designed to be accessible, really. Or it was, but it's just really poorly communicated.
Okay.
So citizens feel really distant. And so it's really important to bring back these opportunities to feedback and influence back to citizens, because we can't just rely on the ambition of EU policymakers. And certainly we can't just rely on the influence of corporate lobbying that is dragging us down. So part of my job, I'm actually working for a campaign specifically on the issue of planned obsolescence, but I also follow everything that relates to sustainability at the EU level. And so part of my
What was
job
the thing you were specifically working on?
It's a campaign that targets planned obsolescence. So the fact that products, and especially electronic products, fail after a certain time, because then, you know, designed to fail or they're not repairable.
Okay.
And of course, from a sustainability point of view, we want to extend the life of these products.
Right.
So I'm working on that, but no worries. But I also, tell me, because there's a lot of jargon, especially in the EU, and working there, you tend to use a lot of jargon. So don't hesitate to interrupt. And yes, on the side, I'm really interested in everything that relates to sustainability and sustainability policies. And so what I'm trying to do is really to try to make those concepts accessible and understandable by as many people as possible. And also through the Burning Case podcast that I recently launched, is to give means of actions to people that feel distant and disillusioned.
Disillusioned or
disillusioned,
okay.
from policy making, and a lot of people feel that way, especially in Europe. So that's kind of the goal, is break down these concepts, but also provide means of action, so that we don't just have informed citizens. We have informed citizens that are ready to act and get involved in the policymaking process.
I think that's so important, because there's so many important conversations happening in the United States right now, whether it's racial justice or sustainability. I think conversations are happening because they just couldn't not happen anymore, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, okay, great, I know about this problem, but then it's really overwhelming to say, okay, shit, I know about the problem, but now, what do I do? What do I do with all this information?
Exactly. And whether it's sustainability, whether it's racism, whether it's gender equality, the problem is, for a very long time, and that's especially the case when it comes to sustainability, we've put the responsibility and the blame on individuals. It's like, it's your fault if there's climate breakdown, because you fly too much, because you eat too much meat, because you consume too much. And partially it's true, it's our responsibility as individuals as well. The problem is, if you make your zero waste toothpaste, or if you reduce your meat consumption, it's great. It's going to make you feel better. And it's a great first step towards being informed.
Right.
But even if everyone starts being super conscious, eco-conscious on the planet, we're not going to get to where we need in order to preserve human life and just life on Earth. Because we need a radical change. We need a policy change, and we need an economic change. And this can only happen if we mobilize to change the system. So not just ourselves, which is super important, don't get me wrong, but we also need to get to that next step of mobilizing at policy level. And policymakers aren't too keen on, letting us do that, because that would literally mean changing the status quo. So they're not really open. So this is why it's so important to really understand policy processes, where are the opportunities to lobby for change, all these kind of things where we can push and pressure in order to really achieve this system change, which needs to come as well as the individual change.
I think that is so important to talk about, because especially at first, when I started learning about sustainability, I felt like, one, I needed to change the world. Like it was like my responsibility. And if I messed up any of my individual actions, I was a terrible person.
Yeah.
And not that you shouldn't, like you said, strive for that and do all those things, not only for your own health and well-being, but they contribute. But the system change is really, really important. And I think that conversation is happening more and more here, at least in the States, and just overall, because it's much easier for systems to stay in place if they like distract us and say, buy this like reusable water bottle and do this and do that. But that's really hard, I think, specifically in not only the United States, but in my town. There's a lot of talk about racism, specifically Indigenous people. We're right next to a reservation. So there's a lot of really important conversations happening right now. And I think what's really hard for people to wrap their head around is like that it's systematic. To talk about racism, for someone who doesn't want to have that conversation, to not think you're calling them a racist. And to say like, no, I'm just saying that the system we're in is built on these foundations is really hard to wrap your head around.
It is. I think it's really hard to just acknowledge privilege, and especially white privilege. I've been following a lot what's been happening in the US, but I have to say I'm not an expert in what's happening in the US either.
Right.
I am more familiar, I would say, with what's happening in the EU, though of course the US influences a lot the EU. But I feel like there's these systematic issues, and we've been putting a lot of the blame on individuals, as I was saying. And there's also this notion of privilege, even in the environmental movements. That goes with this, blaming the individuals. Not everybody is able to, just live a zero waste lifestyle. I mean, you have to admit it's convenient to buy prepackaged product, because that means you don't need the time to do your products. You don't need to, sometimes it's more expensive. Let's face it, I don't know what it's like in the US. Sometimes you don't live near a zero waste shop, because let's be honest, at least here in Europe, it's mostly in privileged, white, wealthy neighborhoods. Absolutely. Where young people are getting more and more interested. We have a lot of disadvantaged neighborhood here in Brussels, and I'm actually currently studying the amount of zero waste / organic shops and where they are located here in Brussels. And it's really interesting, because you see that most of them are located in wealthy neighborhoods and not in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And I created an NGO a few years ago that did sustainability education in high schools, especially disadvantaged neighborhoods. And it was really interesting conversation, because for them, they didn't really see why they were supposed to care about the environment, because they just had so much to focus on a day-to-day basis. That the school was really shitty. They didn't really have that many perspective for the future. The parents were struggling to get by at the end of the month. And so they're like, why should I care about climate change? It's like, it's a rich problem. And they weren't wrong. The privileged people really have to acknowledge their privilege first and realize that it's mainly their responsibility to act on that. And it's through relevant public policies, it's through relevant investments. You can't expect everyone to live a zero waste lifestyle or eco-friendly lifestyle if it's not accessible to them.
Right.
And for years and years and years, what we've been doing, and for me, that's a big part of the problem, is that instead of removing the bad stuff from the shelves, from the supermarket, from the shops, like the bad products, we've been putting an eco premium on the good ones, which make them even less accessible.
Yes.
So buying organic is going to cost you more. So instead of just banning some certain products or just banning food that comes from the other side of the world at certain seasons, or just maybe not banning, but making them more expensive actually, so that the price of organic products, of local products reduces. We've been doing it the other way around. And this just doesn't make sense at the end of the day, because we, putting even more the blame on these privileged people, oh, they're not eating organic, they're not eating that way or consuming that way. But it's because it's actually cheaper. And
Absolutely.
that doesn't make sense at all. And we really need a proper policy change on that.
So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the work you're doing and that you talk about is really about like systematic change. And so like, that's where a lot of your focus comes in. So when people are, let's say, like listening to this podcast episode and they're like, okay, we need systematic change, what do you tell people that are kind of first starting out in that journey? Like where do we start?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I just want to say that for me, it was a process. Like if I take you back 10 years, I was living in Paris. I was consuming, like my life was around consumption. So, Paris is a very fashionable city, and I have some friends that work in the fashion sector or, like the communication sector. So it was really about always consuming like fashion, always like kind of looking different, always looking cool for the parties and the clubs and everything. And so I used to consume a lot. And then my parents, one of them's a journalist and the other one traveled a lot. So I spent a lot of my childhood and my teenage years flying around the world. I am probably one of the most privileged people when it comes to traveling. I've been to a lot of countries. And I had no idea, like I was just completely clueless. And then I went to university. And one thing I always loved was animals. I loved animals my whole life. And when I got to university, there was a scandal in France about palm oil and how palm oil was partly responsible for the deforestation in Indonesia. And so, you could see like pictures of orangutans dying in forests. And that was really shocking to me. And that was like the starting point of it all. Like I started from being probably one of the worst offender when it comes to the environment to kind of starting to learn about the environment. And I studied something completely different. And then after my bachelor degree, I was like, I'm really interested in those issues. I want to learn more. So I ended up doing a master's in environmental science and management.
Okay.
And even during my master's and for a few years after, I thought that I could buy my way into sustainability like a lot of people. I was really putting the focus on individual change. So I went vegan, I flew much less, and I have to say I still fly. But I flew much less. I started to consume super zero waste. I was very strict. And as you were saying, I was exactly like you. I was just like blaming myself when I was ordering out or, doing something that wasn't super eco. And so, yeah, I was literally like on that path. And then I started learning. I started listening to podcasts or listening to people or reading books and kind of really understanding that, as I was saying, even if I convinced everyone around me to live that same lifestyle, it would have an impact for sure, but it wouldn't have the necessary impacts to actually tackle climate breakdown. So I think that's really what I want to say, is that it's a process. And maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're not to the level of influencing policy making, and that's fine. If you're already taking the steps in your everyday life, that's great. It really is amazing, because you're already, maybe even in your community, you're maybe the first one. So it's really great. So don't beat yourself up. It's just that if you've been doing this little individual change for a while and you think maybe it's time to take it to the next level, then you should. You shouldn't be put off by it. It's hard to influence policymaking. It's impossible. I can't do it as an individual. We can all do it. I know it's in the US, it can be a bit different, the processes and how to meet, because there's like the Senate and there's like the Chamber of Representatives. So it's a bit different, but we can all influence our policymaking, even the super local one. It's completely doable. I'm doing a little bit of self-promotion here, but as part of the Burning Case, we're actually going to release at the end of the year a series of episodes that is exactly about what are the steps that we can take, and anyone can take, to become a citizen lobbyist. That's what we call it. So to really pick your issue, identify who you're supposed to influence, how to form a coalition, how to and this works at every level, from the super basic level. If you're in a little village and the mayor wants to cut some trees in the park, and you're super against that because you're like, why should we cut some trees instead of planting it? Or
Right.
the mayor doesn't want to allow one vegetarian meal in the school, or all these little things.
Right.
That's fine. That's your level. If you want to go higher, it also works. If you even want to go European and influence European policy making, it also works. And we're going to make it super concrete and hands-on so that everybody can learn these steps, these tools, and influence people themselves. So that it really depends on where you are in this journey.
I love that. I'll have to stay in touch and share that so I can share it out. That sounds amazing, because I think that's the problem for a lot of people. It's like, I care about this, I'm interested, but I'm like so unfamiliar, and it's really overwhelming. The internet is scary when you Google like how to solve this problem. But I want to circle back and say I so appreciate you talking about your own journey and it being a process, because I think that's another thing that makes this conversation really inaccessible. And I know, like I mentioned, when I first started diving in, I was like all in. I have to be zero waste. I have to fit my trash in a jar for the year. And I have to, like I'll be vegan forever. That's for a whole another host of reasons. But I was like, this. And it was also not fun anymore. It was also, it felt like a burden. It felt like I was judging myself. I was judging all the people around me. Because I was like, why don't you understand? I'm saving the world. Why aren't you saving the world with me? And knowing it's a process, I think, is important, because there are some quote unquote influencers on social media that I think, whether it's intentional or not, give the impression that it's like they came out of the womb as this like eco-friendly, like perfect human, and like don't acknowledge that it's a process. So then you feel shitty when you look at how great they're doing, and you're like, God, they know how to be environmentally friendly and how to do all these things without acknowledging, like, yeah, I lived in Paris and I was a part of this, and this. Like, I think of, even a few years ago, how my knowledge and practices around sustainability, they're wildly different.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Wildly different. And to not acknowledge that, and I had to like get out of that phase. Like, people talk about the angry vegan phase. I feel like that is so real. It is so real. I feel like there's an angry vegan, angry sustainability activist. Like, there's that phase where you get all the information and you're like, oh, this shit is really messed up.
Yeah.
And
I think you need to process things.
Yes.
Like it's not easy, like learning about all the terrible things that are happening in the world. It's scary, it's sad, and you have all the rights to be angry. But as you said, I think it's a phase, and if it's not, it's okay as well. Everybody does their own thing. But I think it's about choosing your battle as well. And what I realized is that I was just like you, like I was really angry at a lot of people around me. And that ended up making me really sad, because I was judging my friends all the time. I was judging my family. I couldn't go on a vacation with people without just being like, you're ordering a plastic straw? Like, seriously, do you not care about turtles at all?
Yes.
Like meat? Oh my God, you're disgusting. And I was, as you said, I was just like not enjoying, and I was angry all the time. And it kind of wore off, and I wouldn't be able to say like what changed, but it did change, and I'm so grateful, and I'm so happy that it did, because I wasn't enjoying myself anymore. And now I try to judge people less. What I realize is also, like, I have friends and a lot of them don't care about sustainability, and that makes me sad, but I love them for other reasons. I love them because they're loyal, because they're funny, because they're smart, because they're good friends, because we've been through a lot together, and that's fine, And like I love my parents. They still eat meat. They're not eco-friendly. They fly a lot, but still love them. So you kind of need to focus on what you love, and also choose your battle and save your energy. And I've also realized that it's like being angry and blaming people. It takes a lot of energy. And at the end of the day, if you really want to make a change, you've got a limited amount of energy to dedicate to a cause. And that cause can be anything. It can be veganism, it can be zero waste, it can be just put your energy in this, try to at least, rather than focus on the little things. Because once again, the little things aren't going to change the world, no matter how good they are.
Right.
They're great, but they're not going to change the world and your energy. And also there's this thing that I really like is like, I can't remember what it says exactly, but it's like resting or focusing on mental health. It's actually an act of rebellion in a capitalist system that encourages constant productivity, constant
yes,
having your brain, buzzing. So just taking a step back and focusing on your mental health and your energy and where you want to focus it, that's already an act of resistance. You don't need to be everywhere at once.
yeah.
But it takes a while to figure that out.
Yes, and I think that's so important. I'm a health and wellness coach, and one of the things that really motivated me to do that was realizing when I feel my best, when I feel healthy, when I'm eating right, when I'm nourishing my body, all the things,
yeah,
then I am way more capable of showing up for the world and all the things I care about. So if I can help people individually feel better, like selfishly, I feel like I'm setting them up to then be better citizens and take care of the world, because we can't tackle those things when our tank is empty.
Yeah.
And I've tried many times to tackle the world's problems on empty, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Yeah. And I think the thing you said about anger and energy is really important too, because I've been thinking a lot lately about how it's okay to be angry. It's like what you do with it.
Yeah.
So like, I'm angry at all these things, but being angry at my friends isn't changing anything, but being angry at the system could maybe change some things.
Exactly. It's who you direct your anger towards.
Yes.
No, I completely agree with that.
So would you say that veganism was kind of your like insert point into this movement?
Not really, because I have to say, when I studied environmental science and management, it was actually it wasn't funny, but it's interesting to see that even in a master's about sustainability, and that was 7 years ago, so maybe that has changed since. And I know with the other degrees, they really addressed the problem of animal farming.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, it was never addressed as an issue. I mean, it was addressed as an issue, but from a like the solutions to make cows fart less, you know, and we can reuse cow poo for other reasons, but it was never the actual concept of animal farming that was considered an issue. And I learned that from later. So I wouldn't say that was my entry point. My entry point, I think, in the whole sustainability, eco-friendly was really palm oil and deforestation. Because as I said to you in the beginning, like forests are really my weak points.
Yeah.
So that was my entry point, and then learning about different things, and actually I became vegetarian for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I think about 2 years, and then I went vegan. I think classic journey, watched Cowspiracy, found out about different studies, and just at the end of the day, I took a dog as well, and she's my baby. She's the love of my life, and I just couldn't make the difference between my dog that I was literally cherishing, like she is the most precious thing for me, and a veal, or I mean not a veal, but I don't know how you call that in French. You say a veau, so I don't know. Is it like the baby cow?
Oh yeah.
Calf or whatever. And I just I couldn't make the difference anymore. And also it was both for animal rights reasons, of course, but also for sustainability reasons that I went vegan.
Yeah, it's been interesting to talk to people on the podcast. It's been, and this just happened organically through conversations I've had with people, that food and veganism specifically has been an entry point for a lot of people into sustainability, myself included, because I just went vegan for health reasons. And then it was like the domino effect of all the other things that come along with the agriculture systems and everything else.
Exactly.
So I was just curious if that was your journey as well, but it sounds like the orangutans and the palm oil, which is something I don't know enough about. Like that is, I've talked to one other guest about palm oil, but I think I'm surprised that doesn't get talked about more.
There was a big outrage about palm oil in Europe a few years ago. And actually, it's funny because my first job, I think I can talk about that now because I've left it a few years ago, but essentially my first job was as a sustainability consultant in a sustainability consultancy firm, working for big companies, trying to make their supply chain deforestation free. And what commodity did I end up working on as my first job? Palm oil.
Of
I only
course, the
worked on palm oil.
universe, of
Yeah.
course.
And what I learned, and that kind of applies to all of my views on sustainability. I used to really think that it was like black and white the whole time, and now I don't anymore. And it's especially true with all types of commodities. Like commodities are like products essentially. And for palm oil, I learned that there's no such thing as black and white, because 45% of palm oil is actually produced by what is we call smallholders. And smallholders are farmers that work on land that I think is less, I'd have to double check, but I think it's less than 5 hectares. So it's actually quite small.
Okay.
1 hectare, I can't remember. I need to double check. So it's essentially peasants, like really small, like farmers that own really small pieces of land that produce 45% of the world's palm oil.
Wow.
So like saying we don't want to use palm oil anymore is not a good idea, because you're potentially putting millions of people in Indonesia and Malaysia at risk of extreme poverty and just not having a job and not having money to feed their kids anymore. So it's really complicated, because we've created this globalized system where we promised some people on the other side of the world that we would, pay them for certain activities, whether it's fashion, whether it's food. But the thing is, our demand for these products has increased so much that we are responsible for the deforestation of these forests and the pollution, the environmental consequences. And at the same time, we're still paying these people really shit amount of money. So it's really about rethinking the system from also not only a sustainable point of view of like, let's stop deforestation, but also from a fair and economic point of view, because we made them dependent on our consumption of palm oil. So how can we make this a different system so that, yes, there's no deforestation anymore, but at the same time, we're not completely dropping these millions of people that depend on palm oil to have a living.
Is there talks in the EU about how to kind of transition when we talk about some of those systems changing? So I know in the US, when people have been talking about dairy farming and beef farming for cattle, there's been some money been like kind of trying to be thrown around, and other conversations about, okay, well, we don't want you to not farm. We just want you to farm different things. Yeah. So like soy or whatever it is. And there's been talks about how to help those farmers transition. So they're not doing dairy anymore. They're doing another crop. Is there talks like that in the EU?
So the problem, yes, there are, but that mainly applies to EU farmers, because it's this concept that is very strong in international law of national sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So as the EU, we wouldn't be able to say to Indonesia, stop deforestation. However, what we can say, and this goes back to the discussion we had at the beginning of these trade agreements that are so powerful, we can say, we will buy your palm oil, but we need to implement a system to ensure that this palm oil is deforestation free. So this is ongoing, and it has been the case for woods. That's the word, right? Woods, like wood, I guess. That comes from other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. There's a certification program that is in place to ensure that this wood that enters the EU is not related to deforestation. The problem, as always, it's the implementation and the tracking and making sure that there's money that is being put in the implementation of this, so that there's no fake certificates or that there's no transparency in the supply chain. But on paper, these would be great, because it's a partnership. It's not us Europeans, white people saying to Indonesia, you deforest your own forest for our consumption, now you need to stop. It's about implementing a partnership and saying, we will probably still buy your palm oil, maybe at a higher price, because we'll consume less of it. And in exchange, we need this product to follow a certain set of rules to ensure that not only does it not lead to deforestation, but it also leads to farmers being paid a fair price.
Yeah. So that's a lot. It sounds like that's a lot of the lobbying you've been working on, or at least you're really knowledgeable about, is those trade agreements and that like partnership, which is so interesting because I don't think that at least I have heard that conversation as much about the value that those agreements, like trade agreements for commodities and products, can have between whether it's farmers or production. That's really interesting.
They're super powerful, these trade agreements. The problem is there's a lot of lobbying going on because, of course, some industries in Europe want Europe to sign a trade agreement with the Mercosur because for them, it's not necessarily about receiving meat and soy and a bunch of things from South America. It's about having less taxes for them to ship their products to South America. So notably cars and pharmaceutical products. Of course, you ask any car manufacturers, they would love to enter the South American market. They would love to sell their cars, their trucks, whatever. But the problem is, like, this is like the basis of having trade agreements that promote consumption and shipping of goods is unsustainable. So we need to transform them to make them weapons and tools of sustainability rather than just money and profits, essentially. And if they use that way, they can be really powerful tools. But we need to ensure that there's no loopholes, because currently there's a lot of loopholes that allow for not necessarily good stuff.
So is the your podcast that I haven't gotten to listen to yet, but I'm really excited because I just saw that as I was looking again at your page. I was like, oh, she has a podcast, and that's pretty new, recent. Right?
Like there's only 2 episodes out, and the next one is coming. Yeah,
I was like, I swear this didn't exist a while ago, but I'm really excited about that. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the Green Seed Project. So that's the NGO you mentioned.
Yeah.
In the beginning, but if you could talk a little bit more about that, I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah. So it's currently, unfortunately, on hold because of the coronavirus. But essentially, the idea was to talk about sustainability in schools, high schools, and universities, but without necessarily going through the angle of climate breakdown. Because for a lot of youth that we meet, especially in the disadvantaged neighborhoods where we've been working, if you've been living in an urban area your whole life, including with financial struggle, you don't necessarily care about the fact that there's less worms in the earth, in the soil, or you don't really care about, it's not your priority.
It's so removed from their experience. Exactly. Yeah.
So I was kind of thinking of how we could talk about sustainability and these issues, but through a different angle that makes more sense to them. So this is how we kind of came up with 3 different topics that we propose to teachers, and they choose based on what they're doing in class. And these 3 topics are related to consumption, and they're fashion, plastic, and food, because you dress up every morning, you eat 3 times a day, and you encounter a lot of plastic in your everyday life. And based on this, we developed a 3 steps methodology, which is essentially raising awareness, having a debate, and then empowering them to implement their own projects to tackle this issue.
Oh, I love that.
And the great thing with that methodology is that we can talk about climate breakdown, we can talk about overconsumption, we can talk about workers' exploitation, but through something that makes a lot of sense to them. Because fashion, they wear these brands that are problematic. They eat the food that sometimes causes climate breakdown, and they use plastic, because we all do. And I have to say, it's not about pointing the finger or blaming. It's really about making them see that they're part of a bigger system and that they can actually act on that system. And the last part is, of course, my favorite, because they know about the issue. We've had a debate around that where they can ask all the questions, and then we usually tend to end up the discussions in like, why is the capitalist system exploiting workers and nature?
I love that. And
it's really great. And the third part is really about, so we have a methodology. I'm not going to get into that, but we asked them to come up with a solution that they could implement in their community or in the school or in their class to tackle one of the issue. And just to give examples of projects that were presented, it's lobbying the head of the school to have, because here in Belgium, you need to wear sports clothes that have the name of the school most of the time. So, école de blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And like lobbying the head of the school so that the t-shirts and the shorts would be bought from would be made from organic cotton and fair trade.
Wow.
It's about making sure that maybe the soda machine gets removed and is replaced by a water fountain. It's about organizing a secondhand sale in school with like parents and the local communities. It's about going to the local policymaker to ask that there's less ads on the streets and more promotion for, I don't know, recycling or waste reduction or all this kind of thing. So these are projects that were proposed and some of them were actually implemented. So we were really proud when that
That's
happened.
amazing. That's so amazing. I think that when I'm disheartened about the world and everything going on, when I think of some of the like young people like that and that generation that is in school right now, they know so much more than I did at that age about what's going on in the world. That is like gives me hope.
And it's really great. And I think it like for me, one of the reasons also I wanted to do this project is because I work a lot in policymaking. So I work with people that are completely disconnected from reality. Let's be very honest. And a lot of my job is policy position papers and feedbacks on that specific legislation and doing a social media campaign to put pressure on that specific representative. And it's really abstract. It's not concrete at all. Of course, we're talking about legislation that would impact a lot of things. So that's great. But it really is kind of disconnected. And I know a lot of people that work in that field. And once again, you do what you do best. But I know a lot of people working in the policy sector on sustainability. They don't necessarily, live a zero waste lifestyle. They don't necessarily don't eat meat. It's, you do what you can do. But so for me, I really needed that kind of connection with the grassroots level, with the kids, with the schools, with very concrete hands-on solutions. And to me, that was also a way of finding balance between the policymakers and the influencing and lobbying and the policy bubble, and then going to these schools and meeting these kids and kind of working on long-term project with them. That was kind of my balance.
Oh, I love that. I would love to chat with you more about that. I think we need a chapter of that NGO here. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's been, honestly, it's been a great project. I'm a little bummed that it's currently on hold, but it's because of here, the schools closed in March. So from March to June, the kids didn't have to go to school. This year it's going to be really complicated because they need to essentially do 1 year of school, but also the 3 and 4 months that the kids missed last year. So they don't really have time for outside projects, unfortunately. So we might start it again in January, but it's not sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's so much going on with all of that. In that vein, working on all of this, specifically being on the policy level, I feel like that can probably, I don't want to assume, but I'm guessing that can be overwhelming at times to do that work. How do you stay grounded? Like, what do you do to like come back into consciousness and kind of take care of yourself?
It's an interesting question because I preach a lot about healthcare, but I'm really bad at it. Self-care, sorry. I'm really bad at it. And I notice that regularly. I'm not taking care of my mental health at all. And it's tricky because I don't really have a solution to that. I would love to be able to do yoga more and work less hours and be able to escape to the countryside every weekend. I can't. I mean, I say to myself, I can't. I don't know. I think I probably could. And like, for instance, this summer, because, you couldn't fly anywhere else. So we had holiday. We actually planned to go hiking in Canada. And we were really excited because we had never been to Canada. And, nature is amazing in Canada. So we thought it'd be great. And of course, that was canceled. And so instead, we decided to explore the mountains in the south of France. And we kind of went on little, when I say we, it's me and my boyfriend, we went on a hiking trip, and it was great because 1 night out of 2, we were sleeping in tents at the summit of the mountain. So no Wi-Fi, no phone connection, no electricity, walking 6 and 7 hours, eating something, and then just going to bed at 9 because you're exhausted and everything hurts. But that was great. And I felt amazing. I have to say, I felt really, really good. And it's always like that. I come back and I'm like, oh, I'm going to try to do like this more often, to disconnect and to go on weekends. After 2 weeks, back in the swing of things. And like, I'm connected 24/7. I check the news before going to bed. I check the news when I wake up. I check Twitter all the time. I And I know I shouldn't, but I haven't really found a way to deal with this. So I guess the things that I try to do is yoga and work out, and thank God I have dogs, so I have to take them on walks, and that's a really great excuse, to get out and
Yes.
just take walks with the dogs. Like every weekend we go in the forest, so that's really nice, and I'm so grateful that we have dogs. But yeah, other than that, I'm pretty bad, I have to say.
Process.
I'm trying to, I'm trying to improve, but it's just at the moment there's just so much to do, and we have such limited amount of time that I'm like running around like a headless chicken.
Yeah, I do a solo podcast episode every week too, just like a short
Yeah,
one. And this week I talked about like what is self-care really?
yeah,
Because I think it's been co-opted, especially on social media,
yeah,
as this like self-care can only be this very luxurious, expensive thing. And I was like,
yeah,
I think we have to remind ourselves that self-care can be drinking enough water that day.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
self-care is
Like
like
the
a
little things.
constant,
Yeah,
everyday nourishing. And yeah, I mean, it can be a bubble bath. That's great. That sounds amazing. But
yeah,
it doesn't have to be.
yeah,
Like it can be making yourself a really good dinner.
yeah, exactly, and I'm gonna try to disconnect more. We haven't really been able to do that, but this is on my to-do list, and yeah, let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As I'm trying to like grow my business and grow this podcast, and
yeah,
I'm sure you relate, it's just like constant. You're like, oh, I could be doing this. I could be doing this. I should
yeah,
be working on this. I can reach out to these new people to be on the podcast.
yeah.
And I have been working to disconnect more. And a couple weekends ago, I did like a 48-hour no social
Ooh,
media.
nice.
So just like Friday evening to Sunday evening.
Yeah.
And I sound like such a millennial because I was like, oh my gosh, 2 days with no social media. But when you're trying to grow a business, like
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah,
it's a lot. But I felt like a new woman. I was like,
yeah,
oh my gosh, it made me like delete a few people and unfollow some things too that I was like, oh, it was really nice not seeing that.
yeah,
Why
yeah,
don't I just not
exactly.
see that all the time? Not
Yeah,
just
I
when I'm
know.
not on social media. So it's definitely, that's a process too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It is, and that might be what I'm gonna try to do. I don't know yet.
Right.
I feel like September and December anyway in my line of work is always super busy.
Mm.
So it's not the greatest period to try new things, but I still have a lot of holidays to take from work, so I still need to figure out where I'm gonna take that.
Well, if you come to Canada, depending on where you go, I'm like an hour from the Canadian border.
Ooh,
So if
nice,
you
nice.
want to go
Yep.
hiking, let me know
I will. I will definitely.
someday.
We will see if Canada reopens and if
I
we can actually
know.
fly out of Europe next year. But if it's possible, we'll definitely come to Canada next year.
Yeah, I can't go through the border right now either. Canada's like, nope,
Yeah.
you are
Yep.
not taking this global pandemic seriously, and they're not wrong.
Exactly.
I can't argue with them. We're
Yeah.
not doing great in the States. So
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll let you know for sure.
Is there anything that you want to share or you want to talk about that you feel like I didn't give you space to do?
um. No, I think we addressed. I mean, a lot of the like interesting and important topics. I would I don't even know. Like most of your listeners are from the US, or are they mostly global?
A lot of US, but global actually is growing.
Okay. Yeah, because I think what's really important is, and it sounds easy, and I know a lot of people think it's not, but it's about seizing back a democracy. And I know it feels like a
I
lot of the
love
time,
that. Just pause
yeah.
on that. Seizing back a democracy. Yes. Okay, keep going.
Because a lot of the time, and I know it's especially the case in the US, like a lot of people are saying it's not a democracy anymore, like it's
Mm-hmm.
been, and it's a super polarized society, and it's really complicated, and politics is a complicated topic. But at the end of the day, we still live in democracy, whether we like it or not, and whether we think it's a democracy or
Right.
not. And there's a lot of countries around the world that do not live in a democracy. And let me tell you, there's a big difference. And but the thing is, we've lost over the years that connection with democracy and the very simple way of providing feedbacks and providing and just, you know, engaging with the policymaking. And nowadays, and a lot of people around me feel that way. You feel like you get to vote and express your opinion once every 5 years or 4 years, depending on how many years mandate is, and that's it. And in between these 5 years or 4 years, you don't get a voice. And a lot of people feel that way, and this is why they feel really disconnected from politics and policymaking. But that's not true. That is absolutely not true. You can influence policymaking in between these 5 years. And this is like the basic citizen's duty, of course, if you're able to, and of course, if you're privileged enough to do that. Absolutely. I wouldn't expect like a single mom of even one kid to just like have time to engage in those processes. Right. But if you are able to, and if you have time to live a zero waste lifestyle, I promise you also have time to engage with politics. It's doable. There are tools out there. If anyone's interested, just reach out. I can send some stuff. I'm actually reading a book right now that it was written by the two of the people that organized Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2006. And I think it's called How to Organize a Revolution or something like this. And it's about grassroots organizing. And of course, your first step doesn't necessarily need to engage in a presidential campaign. It can be very little and very local stuff. But there are plenty of things that we can do. And we need to do that because we can't just sit on our ass all day and complain about politics and systemic and the fact that the system isn't changing. We need to make it change. We need to pressure for change. And the first thing literally can be join your local gardening center or join your local plastic-free association or whatever. But we need to organize and we need to seize that democracy back, because otherwise it's going to drift away from us and we'll only realize we would have lost it once it's gone, and then we won't be able to do anything about it anymore. So now there's a threat, clearly. There's, of course, climate breakdown that is a threat. There's a lot of things, racism, systemic injustice, but we are losing democracy. That's a fact. And we need to seize it before it goes away, because I promise you, a world without democracy is not a world I want to live in.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I think that is so important. If you have any resources you think would be helpful and you want to send them my way, I can put them in the show notes for this episode too. And I just want to, I know that you've been so great with time. You said something that sparked a thought I had earlier. You've been using the phrase climate breakdown.
Yeah.
Is that an intentional choice of words? Can you tell me a little bit about that real quick?
So the thing is, I can send you an article about The Guardian, actually, which is like this UK media, and they chose, I think 2 years ago, to completely change their vocabulary, because climate change, like, words are really important, right? And saying climate change doesn't at all reflect the urgency and the crisis we're in. Climate breakdown reveals that it's breaking down. It literally is. It's not just changing, because change can be positive, it can be negative, it can be huge, it can be super small. But breakdown means a breakdown, or climate crisis as well. It's just choosing your words carefully to highlight the situation that we're in and not reduce it to something it's not. And I feel like climate change is not even like closely to being strong enough to talk about the greatest threat to humanity, because this is it at the end of the day. It's the greatest threat to humanity. So until we actually call it that way, we'll never be able to address it the way it needs to be addressed. So for me, it's really important to say climate crisis or climate breakdown rather than say climate change or global warming.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate that explanation. And I think I will do a intentional job to change that language as well. Because even when you said climate breakdown, I feel like I had a different reaction. Like when you say that, you're like, oh, breakdown. We've all had a breakdown. Like, we know that's not good. And climate change, you're right, is just kind of like, oh, things are like, meh, they're ebbing and flowing and whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So words really do matter. So we need to try to use the right words when possible.
I appreciate that. Thank you you mentioned it earlier, you said it earlier, and we were like on some really good topic. And I was like, okay, come back to that. So I'm glad you said it again.
Cool.
Well, thank you very, very much for making this work. I really appreciate it. I think everything we talked about is so useful, and I know will
I'm
be
glad.
so well received. And I look forward to continuing to connect with you and learn
Yeah.
from you and
Same.
all of that.
Yeah.
So
Same. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It was really great chatting about all these kind of things. It's interesting to also hear from like a US perspective, because I tend to be really wrapped in my EU bubble. So it's interesting to chat with someone who's based in the US. And yeah, let's keep in touch. And good luck with the bear.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope they come back from a distance.
Yeah, from a distance, that'd be better, probably.
Yes. Thanks for listening to another episode of Consciously Clueless. Chloe was so lovely to talk to and was really, really good at reminding me and hopefully all of you to enjoy the process and to remember that it's a process. We don't have to change everything overnight, but we can make real systematic change. If you're enjoying this podcast, hit subscribe wherever you're listening. If you want to help this podcast grow, share it with a friend, text it to a family member, post on social media, get it into the ears of more listeners. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts and you could get read on air as a review of the week. Until next time.